Welcome to today's webinar, Parks as Community Infrastructure During and Beyond the Pandemic, Building Trust to Advance Equity, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I am Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, which is supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and is managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. Today's program is the 8th offering of Planning with Purpose, a Smart Growth Network webinar series on community revitalization. In this series, the Smart Growth Network is sharing new ideas and approaches taken from current planning issues and case studies that have made us aware of the need to broaden our smart growth lens. We want to share with and learn from you, with the hope that together we can create communities of the future that are healthy, equitable, and resilient for everyone. I would also like to acknowledge Jennifer Hirsch of EPA's Office of Community Revitalization, who organized today's webinar with us. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to get smart growth news and information and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Parks as Community Infrastructure During and Beyond the Pandemic, Building Trust to Advance Equity. You can also search for event number 922-1572. So to get started, our speakers today are Daryl Haddock, Ayanna Williams, Anna Gordon, Sarah Hammerschmidt, and Lyric Kelker. Daryl Haddock is the Environmental Education Director for the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance. Daryl coordinates educational programs, community outreach, and citizen science research activities, and he also participates in WAWA's day-to-day operations. He also serves as the Urban Waters Federal Partnership Coordinator for the Proctor Creek Ambassador, or as the Proctor Creek Ambassador. Sorry about that, Daryl. Ayanna Williams is the Director of Community and Environmental Resilience person at the National Recreation and Parks Association. Prior to joining ARPA earlier this year, she was the Healthy Cities Director at the Nature Conservancy in Georgia, where she mobilized public and private financial support, facilitated equity-centered conversations, and shared stories of impact with caring respect for all. Anna Gordon is the Community Programs Manager for Verde, a nonprofit community-based organization in Portland, Oregon. She manages Verde's community organizing and engagement, environmental education, and leadership development work. Verde serves communities by building environmental wealth through social enterprise outreach and advocacy. Anna has spent more than 10 years building relationships and working alongside members of the community in Northeast Portland's Cully neighborhood. Sarah Hammerschmidt is the Senior Director of Content at the Urban Land Institute, where she develops content and programs focused on the impact of the built environment on public health through the Building Healthy Places initiative. She also leads ULI's work on equitable access to parks and open space. Sarah has done extensive work on issues that lie at the intersection of health and the built environment. And finally, Lyric Kelker is the Policy Director at the Inclusive Action for the City, where she leads policy advocacy and research for better access to government systems and protections for underserved communities throughout Los Angeles. Her current projects include moving work forward for the LA Street Vendor Campaign, the Spark LA Table, and the Small Business Alliance for Equitable Communities. Following their presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can always submit a question anytime during the discussion by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And before we get started today, we're going to do a couple polls, as we often do. The first one is the usual one we do, if you've been here before, and hopefully you have, just asking where everybody is from. So if you have any trouble responding to this, as always, you may need to exit from full screen mode. Just click on the response here. We'll give you about a half minute here to respond, and then we'll get into the presentations. And thanks to our attendees again, and for everybody joining us today. Should have a big crowd. We'll give you another couple seconds to respond. It's always interesting to see the geographic distribution of these and our international audience, how many people are outside the US. So today, 35% of the crowd is in the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast, 20% in the Midwest, 19% in South, 17% West, and 9% international. Now we have one other question for you today, just more specific to this topic, and that is, has COVID impacted the way parks are viewed in your community? And you can select one of these four options. Yes, parks seen as more as an amenity. Parks are viewed as a necessary element of infrastructure. Yes, parks are seen as both amenity and infrastructure. And finally, no change in how parks are viewed in your community. And again, you may need to exit full screen mode to answer. We'll give you a few more seconds to respond, and then we'll turn it over to Daryl.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And thank you again for participating in this. It's good information for us as we kind of frame the discussion today. Okay, so here 66% parks are seen as both amenity and infrastructure. 15% are more of an amenity, 10% more of necessary element of infrastructure, and finally only 9% said there's been no change. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Daryl Haddock. Welcome, Daryl. You need to unmute, Daryl. You are on screen. Just, you need to click on the...
There we are. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daryl Haddock. I'm the Environmental Education Director for the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, which is an environmental nonprofit in the city of Atlanta. And looking forward to moderating the panel today. We'll be discussing the role of parks as essential community infrastructure. One of the challenges we know is that parks are not always seen as that, but more of an amenity oftentimes. And many of you noted in your poll questions how you felt about, parks and the role that parks play locally. Over the last year and a half, the pandemic has emphasized that parks are a vital element in community quality of life. People have been turning to parks like never before. We've been doing so to seek fresh air, exercise, meditation, to get social gathering, to receive our vaccinations, to participate in food distribution sites, and for a host of many other reasons, several of which we'll talk about today. We will hear from several of our panelists that we have a park equity challenge in this country. Several of our panelists will discuss these challenges and how they may have come about and how this wasn't a problem that surfaced overnight. It's tied to policies and practices such as redlining, urban renewal, the war on gangs and drugs, corporate incentives that undermine municipal services, and activities that are rooted in structural racism. We want to look at how we can improve access to and unleash the power of restoring the full bandwidth of municipal resources so that we can have healthier and more amenable parks. But unfortunately, these have become more evident. These stresses have become more evident during the pandemic. To address these iniquities, we all have a part to play. Government agencies, nonprofits, community-based organizations, the private sector, businesses, real estate professionals, and the community at large. Today, we're going to have the opportunity to hear from two national organizations and two community-based organizations seeking to understand how their work contributes to building park equity. First, we're going to hear from Ayanna Williams of NRPA, who will discuss how that organization centers equity in their work. Ayanna will provide some historical perspective and background on how systemic inequities have created very different lived experiences in parks across the country, and what NRPA is doing to help communities move toward just and equitable park systems. Anna Gordon from Verde will tell the story of Cully Park and how the community-led planning and design process transformed the brownfield into a park that led to other community benefits, such as job creation and affordable housing. Sarah Hammerschmidt from the Urban Land Institute will highlight her work on the Building Healthy Places initiative and the role that cross-sector partnerships played in real estate development, public sector investment, nonprofit organization, partnerships, and the philanthropic community providing resources that are all essential for park success. And last but not least, Lyric Kellar will close out the presentation with a focus on the role of parks as economic engines, particularly over the past year with the pandemic, and how as we turn towards recovery efforts, we need to take into account impacts on small business owners and how access to parks play a role in their livelihoods, as well as maintaining and supporting the surrounding community. I'm excited to hear from our panelists, and I'll next turn things over to Ayanna Williams, our first speaker.
Good afternoon. I am excited to share some information with you all today. As it was mentioned, my name is Ayanna Williams, and I'm the Director of Community and Environmental Resilience with the National Recreation and Park Association. NRPA is a leading nonprofit organization. It's a leading nonprofit organization dedicated to building strong, vibrant, resilient communities through the power of parks and recreation. With more than 60,000 members, NRPA advances this mission by investing in and championing the work of parks and recreation professionals and advocates, the catalyst for positive change in service of equity, climate readiness, and the overall health and well-being. Parks and recreation professionals plan, manage, program, and maintain 11 million acres of public parks and green space across the country. That is a lot of land. We are poised to bring community-driven climate solutions that build a healthy, more resilient, and more equitable future for generations to come. And we do that through NRPA's 3 pillars: advancing community health and well-being. We look at equity as the center of all of our work, and we are looking to create climate-ready parks. Many Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other marginalized groups, such as women, LGBTQ+, immigrants, low income, and people with disabilities, lack the opportunity to experience and engage in high quality parks and recreation. Just and fair access to high quality parks creates healthier, cohesive, and stronger communities. Centering equity means parks and recreation professionals focus on racial inequities. They commit to continuous learning and examine how inequitable systems and exclusionary practices are perpetuated. When we center equity, NRPA is examining its role in inequitable systems and perpetuating exclusionary practices. Through the implementation of a diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment and a corresponding action plan, NRPA is systemically and intentionally backing up words with actions. As a membership organization that leads by example, NRPA invites members and affiliates along on this journey. Achieving an equitable future requires recognizing the systemic inequities that have created very different lived experiences in parks across the country. We want to think about how there is currently uneven access and who benefits from that in recreation. Increasingly, there's been discussions and actions focused on expanding access to local parks, public spaces, and recreation for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other minority groups, as well as individuals with disabilities who historically have been excluded. As parks and recreation professionals take steps to correct these inequities, they will need to consider how the following issues might impact access today and in the future. The way that public spaces are designed, built, and maintained, including parks and recreation amenities, influences how these spaces are used and how communities are connected. The ability to foster strong social networks. Local parks and recreation spaces can help cultivate a sense of attachment or belonging to a community, and in doing so, foster civic pride. They also can serve as a space for democracy. Christopher Park in New York City's Greenwich Village was the epicenter for the LGBTQ community movement. And there's a long history of park spaces as a place for protest. In 2020, many local parks were used to organize protests in response to the killing of George Floyd and the movement for Black lives. Park and recreation professionals provide essential services to people in their communities. Lacking access to parks and recreation is an injustice. To achieve just and fair park access for all people, agencies must acknowledge, harness, and celebrate the unique power and resilience that dwell within each community while working to remove the barriers that perpetuate the inequities that exist between them. To achieve just and fair inclusion, park and recreation professionals must not only review the history of local spaces, but also continue to ask questions that expand how to think about equity and corrective injustice and correct these injustices. So you can think about it in a way that is looking at the distributive power of parks. Think about who has the physical access to the parks and the recreation spaces. Think about it procedurally. Who decides the budget, the operations, and the maintenance? Who's thinking about and making the decisions around programming? There's also an interactional component. Who are the people and how are they treated in local parks and recreation spaces? Who feels welcome? Who feels unwelcome? There's a representational opportunity. Do people believe that their experiences, their culture and history are represented in local parks and recreation spaces? Think about how the parks are cared for. How do people steward local parks and recreation spaces, and also the broader environment? One thing that's really important about parks is that there's really broad support across the United States for parks. The overwhelming majority of Americans assert that they personally benefit from local parks and that their communities benefit from local parks. Americans are in agreement that with NRPA's 3 pillars, which are conservation, health and wellness, and social equity. And these are chief priorities for local parks. Parks are a great value. 4 in 5 Americans concur that local parks are well worth the tax dollars spent on them. This passion for local parks has gone unabated for over 25 years, even with dramatic demographic shifts in the United States and the way that technology has transformed how we interact with others and entertain ourselves. Support for local parks is widespread, spanning different age groups, income strata, household types, and political affiliations. There's not many things that you see that type of widespread support for in this day and age. The majority of Americans also agree on the importance of parks and recreation agencies and the use of their facilities to assist the community during and after natural disaster, such as wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. 2 in 3 Americans look to parks and recreation agencies to serve as an emergency distribution center for clean water, food, clothing, and other life necessities. Using recreation and community centers to serve as shelters during and after disasters is also considered very important to 60% of the respondents. Nearly half, 47% of Americans, believe it is important for parks and recreation agencies to contribute equipment and personnel to respond to the immediate threats, such as a cleanup app for downed trees, rescuing stranded residents, and more during and after times of natural disaster. Southern residents are more likely than those in the Northeast to want recreation and community centers used as shelters, 68% and 75% respectively. And I know that there are a lot of people from the Northeast on this call today. As we think about parks and their role in communities, there really are several opportunities to work towards a just transition. There's opportunities for worker retraining and job opportunities through workforce development programs. There's opportunities to remediate toxified lands, to build new infrastructure, and to provide equitably shared benefits. And we'll hear more about examples of those as we go throughout this panel discussion today. This infographic illustrates the different populations that can be vulnerable to climate change. While climate change affects all of us, low-income communities, communities of color, people with chronic diseases or disabilities, children and the elderly are some of the most at risk. Through the social determinants of health framework, medical, and public, and environmental health practitioners know that race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age and education are among the factors that have a real effect on health outcomes. These factors also impact a person or community's ability to respond to additional environmental exposures. That includes climate change. In this country, your zip code has a greater impact on your life expectancy than your genetic code. Therefore, climate solutions present an opportunity to build health equity into our policies and practices at all levels, promoting equitable climate and clean energy solutions will create a more healthy and prosperous future for everyone. And parks are a great space, a public space that can be used to enact some of these changes. If you're interested in learning more about NRPA's work, we do have a webinar that's coming up in October that's going to look at the park's role in state wildlife plans. We have a sustainability summit in February. That's a good opportunity if you are looking to see how sustainability can be meaningfully incorporated into plans for your parks, whether it be in cities, towns, or counties. We also have a green infrastructure stormwater certification, and that's online. It's a virtual self-directed program that is perfect for introducing whether it be staff in your parks department, other people in your cities, it could be stakeholders like community leaders or elected officials who may want to learn more about the basis of stormwater infrastructure, how that can be implemented in parks, looking at things from how you build a coalition to funding mechanisms, as well as citing a project. We would encourage you to join the Parks and Conservation Network on NRPA Connect, which just is an opportunity to really continue the conversation and look at solutions that we're seeing across the country. You can feel free to contact me with questions. I know there will be questions later on, but if we do not get to a question that you have for me specifically, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have additional conversations and continue to learn from each other. I'm going to pass the mic to Anna Gordon, who will speak on Verde's work in Portland, Oregon.
Thank you, Ayanna, for sharing about the important work of the NRPA to create more equitable access to parks. Again, I'm Anna Gordon from Verde. I'm here in Portland, Oregon, and I'm going to share a story that really highlights equity in action through community-led park development in Northeast Portland's Cully neighborhood. This is the story of how a 25-acre landfill, a brownfield, was transformed into a park in one of Oregon's most diverse neighborhoods. Over a 10-year period, Verde, which we are an environmental justice community-based organization, we led the advocacy, fundraising, and community-led design activities, and were able to involve over 600 community members. Cully Park opened in 2018, and I'm going to be sharing more of its story today. So, sorry, I'm not able to advance my slide. All right, excuse me. So the Cully Park site is located in Northeast Portland's Cully neighborhood, which, as I mentioned, is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the state of Oregon. It was annexed into the city later in the 1980s with the promise of more investment to come. But this neighborhood still lacks many amenities, including transportation infrastructure, does not have many sidewalks, has a lot of gravel roads, and lack of access to developed parks. Cully did not have its first park until 2015. We are now starting to see investments in active transportation infrastructure and other amenities, but Cully still lags behind a lot of the inner Portland neighborhoods. But Cully also has a very strong base of community organizations, community leaders, and a really rich network of community and cultural groups. This includes the Living Cully Coalition, which Verde plays a large role in. So Living Cully is a place-based organizing tool for community development without displacement. In 2010, longtime partner organizations that were working in the Cully neighborhood formalized their partnership into Living Cully, which unites these 4 organizations into a collaborative, long-term, community-led effort to improve the quality of life for low-income people and people of color in Cully, and ensure that Cully will always be a place where low-income people and people of color can live and thrive. So the 4 organizations, as you can see on the screen, are Habitat for Humanity, Hacienda Community Development Corporation, the Native American Youth and Family Center, and Verde. And this work really requires both community-led development work, but also a really robust anti-displacement work. So Verde acts as the backbone organization for the Living Cully Coalition, and Verde led the Cully Park project, but the Living Cully partners were really key in both the park development, but also in leading the organizing around affordable housing and anti-displacement work, so we could ensure that this park could be a place where community members could enjoy for years to come without the risk of being displaced from the neighborhood. So the Cully Park site was a rock quarry from 1948 to 1981, and then was filled in as a landfill with construction waste from 1981 to 1991. The landfill owner then filed for bankruptcy, and the site was turned over to the state of Oregon. As many of you may know, landfills nationwide, many have been redeveloped into parks, and so this was a really clear opportunity to increase public access to parks and open spaces in a neighborhood that lacked that access. And so in 2002, the Portland Parks and Recreation acquired the site and took over the management of the landfill in collaboration with the Metro Regional Government and the Department of Environmental Quality. Portland Parks did move forward with a master plan for the site in 2008. However, at that time, they did not have any funding to implement a park development. In response, Verde launched the Let Us Build Cully Park campaign, working with Cully community members and partner organizations. Verde was able to create a public-private partnership between Verde, a nonprofit organization, and the city, the Portland Parks Department, so that Verde could take the lead on fundraising, design, and development of the park, allowing for a community-led approach and deeper community engagement. The Let Us Build Cully Park campaign raised over $13 million from 40 foundations, government, and corporate sources. And a majority of the donors did not typically fund park projects, but supported this park development because of its community-led aspects and its combination of health, education, economic, and environmental benefits. We were able to engage youth in the park design. Over 191 students from schools and from our partner organization After School Programs participated in designing the community garden and the youth play area. Community members were also involved in designing the native gathering garden, the first of its kind in Portland. The park's final design elements included an off-leash dog area, walking paths, exercise stations, overlooks, picnic areas, youth soccer fields, shelters, baseball fields, and soccer fields. And this is a really unique experience for students to learn and be engaged really deeply in their community by helping to design the park elements. Verde also took a very unique approach to testing the health and safety of the landfill site, working with the City of Portland's Brownfield program, the Oregon Health Authority, and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. We worked to create a sampling plan for this to make sure that the soil and air were safe on the former landfill site. But instead of just trusting our government agencies to come back and tell us, all right, this is safe, community members, you can feel free to have your kids play here, we decided to have a community involvement committee that would be involved in every step of the sampling of soil and air. The Community Involvement Committee was made up of 8 community leaders from different cultural communities and community organizations, and they really led the assessment of the health and safety of the landfill. Community members were involved in testing the soil and the air and visiting the soil lab, and really bringing this information back to their communities through informal conversations and formal presentations, and sharing any concerns back with the team. We were able to provide transportation, childcare, and stipends for the Community Involvement Committee members to really value their time. And we were able to develop fact sheets in Spanish, Somali, and English that were shared door to door with community members. Verde also focused on safe access to the park. The park is located on a very busy corridor near an industrial area. And so we led health and safety walking tours and talked to folks about safe access to the park, which ended up in a new amenity being built for the park, which was the green street that Verde constructed leading up to the park to provide better access. It was also very important to community and to Verde that the park provide economic benefit to community members. So we were able to provide, mitigate displacement pressures and also provide wealth building opportunities for community members. Verde runs 2 social enterprises, Verde Build, which is a contracting enterprise, and Verde Landscape, which is a landscape enterprise. And through our social enterprises, we're able to achieve high minority and women-owned contracting goals on the site, meeting a goal of exceeding our goal of 50% and reaching a 76% minority and owned contractor goal on the site. Verde Landscape was able to bring a lot of landscape restoration to the site, planting over 2,000 shrubs, 255 trees, and really restoring those 25 acres of landfill into a natural area and park. When Cully Park is completed, 400 households that did not have access before had new access to a park within a quarter mile of their house. Cully Park opened in 2018 with a big community celebration. It has also inspired the community and the Living Cully partners to dream big. Now that we were able to accomplish this park, in 2015, community members organized alongside the Living Cully partners to shut down a strip club that was adjacent to families' affordable housing. And it is currently being turned into 141 affordable homes called Las Adelitas by our partner organization, Hacienda CDC, creating more affordable homes and more access very close to Cully Park. We believe that park development and community development must go hand in hand with anti-displacement work so that we can ensure that parks can be enjoyed by local people and people of color now and for generations to come. So Living Cully's anti-displacement work includes both grassroots organizing, land banking, and affordable housing development. Through our organizing work, we were able to stabilize all of the 6 mobile home parks in Cully, including one that sits directly adjacent to Cully Park. We did this through organizing in the parks, and community members worked very hard to pass a mobile home zoning designation, which designates the parks as mobile homes so that they cannot be purchased and developed into luxury homes. Through our organizing work, we were also able to land bank a property directly adjacent to Cully Park, which is now being turned into 10 affordable homes through a partner organization. And Living Cully Partners, Habitat for Humanity, the Native American Youth and Family Center, and Hacienda CDC all focus on affordable housing development in the Cully neighborhood, ensuring homes where future generations can thrive and enjoy neighborhood amenities like Cully Park. I'm going to close by touching on the role of Cully Park during the COVID-19 pandemic. First, Cully Park has provided a really important safe outdoor space for our programming. You can see here youth participating in our nature summer camps. We were able to use it as a space for food distribution, for community meetings. We also recently caught up with 7 community members who live close to the park and did some short interviews about how the park has impacted them during the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't have time to share all of their interviews, but I wanted to share some quotes from 3 of our community leaders, Wendy, Teresa, and Olga, who have been involved in the park project since the beginning. So I'm just going to close by reading their quotes. So I will start with Wendy. I was part of the group that helped build the park. I have 4 kids and I'm originally from Yucatan. With my kids, we came to the park during the pandemic because we felt safe. There weren't a lot of people. My son had soccer practice here, and it has been so helpful since I don't drive and we can walk to his practice. We came during the pandemic to walk and get the kids out of the house and clear our minds during this difficult time. We plant our garden here every year, habaneros and other vegetables. Most of the people here in the garden are from close by in the neighborhood and from different cultures, from Yucatan, Guatemala, and Oaxaca. It's multicultural and we support each other. We worked hard to build Cully Park and we achieved it. The garden is beautiful because we're able to teach our kids about how to grow food so they respect food and where it comes from. All right, Teresa. I've lived in the Cully neighborhood for 10 years and have 4 kids. I love my neighborhood because we have Cully Park close by and the community garden. When the pandemic started, my kids were so stressed out. My daughter was diagnosed with anxiety, and so we would come to the park to walk and relax with our masks on and everything. Now that things are starting to open up and my son has been able to start playing soccer again here at the park, he is so happy. I'll finish with Olga. My family and I come to the park for my daughter who needs to do physical therapy for her legs. Climbing at the park has really helped her. My other kids come to play soccer. The garden we use for planting our food from Guatemala, where we are from. It's been 12 years since I was able to taste my traditional food, and since I started planting here, I've had access to the vegetables I need to cook it. During the pandemic, the park has helped us relax and come use an area that wasn't crowded where we felt safe. The park is close to us. We can walk, and we're able to be at the park and the garden at the same time since they are next to each other. Thank you all so much. I know that was a lot very quickly, so please feel free to get in touch. If you have any questions, I'm happy to share more with you. And I'm now going to pass it on to Sarah Hammerschmidt from the Urban Land Institute to talk about the Building Healthy Places initiative.
Thanks, Anna, and wow, what an amazing story of the transformation of Cully Park that touches on, I think, so many important issues: equity and justice, increased green space to benefit people and the environment, community engagement, empowerment, economic development, and justice, and community programming, particularly during a time when parks have really been the only safe places to gather people. Those were really amazing quotes that you shared. I think this just shows how critical parks are to communities and how important it is not only for people to have these spaces to easily and equitably access, but how important it is for all land use professionals, not just public parks departments, to contribute to the creation, the programming, the maintenance of parks and open spaces. So since 2017, the Urban Land Institute has been partnering with NRPA and with the Trust for Public Land on 10-Minute Walk. And 10-Minute Walk is a movement dedicated to improving access to safe and high quality parks and green spaces in large and small cities throughout the US. It's working to create a world in which by 2050, which doesn't feel that far away, all people live within a 10-minute walk and a safe and accessible 10-minute walk of a high quality park or green space. And there really is a need for this particular goal. According to the Trust for Public Land, across the country, more than 100 million people lack safe and easy access to parks within a half-mile of home. That number represents about 28% of the US population, including 28 million children. And in the nation's 100 largest cities, 11.2 million people lack easy access. The 10-minute walk is calling on local leaders to address these gaps and address disparities in access and quality. And ULI's work on parks is centered within our Building Healthy Places initiative, which we launched just over 8 years ago. ULI, if you're not familiar, is an over 80-year-old nonprofit dedicated to promoting best practices in real estate development. We're a membership organization. We have over 45,000 members globally, and our mission is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. And we at the Building Healthy Places initiative think to have that transformative impact, we really need to be focusing on health and equity within our communities. So the mission of Building Healthy Places is to really leverage our member and partner networks to shape projects and places in ways that improve the health of people and communities in equitable ways. When it comes to improving health and equity in communities, we know it will take partnerships at all levels from all sectors to make meaningful impacts. And we focus on many topics related to health, equity, and the built environment. Over the past just few years, we've really expanded our work on improving access to parks and open spaces, and specifically the role of the private sector in partnerships to increase quality and quantity of parks. ULI as an organization is very cross-disciplinary in nature. We have members from all sectors, but when it comes to our work on parks and open spaces, particularly as it relates to the goals of 10-minute walk, we know it's increasingly important to be engaging the private sector in this work in a collaborative way. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic in particular has really underscored the importance of community outdoor spaces and ensuring that they're properly funded and designed and maintained. You know, we've already heard parks and trails and streets close to automobiles and public plazas have been some of the only places that have allowed people to physically distance and still be able to exercise, relax, play, or reach key destinations. And these are all crucial activities for lowering stress, reducing symptoms of depression, and just maintaining physical health overall. And we know that there are a lot of ways that parks are essential to communities and how they add value. High quality public parks and open space generate economic activity and draw new businesses and visitors to cities. Urban areas derive many benefits, many environmental benefits from parks and green space. Proximity to parks can increase property values as much as 20%, which can increase a city's tax revenue that could then be reallocated to other park improvements. Specifically, investing in parks in areas without sufficient open space can help prevent chronic illness and reduce symptoms of depression. And the positive effects of exposure to green spaces are often amplified in lower income communities that lack access. It's really important to listen to residents when it comes to creating new parks or investing in new amenities to add that value. People aren't going to use parks if there isn't anything that they're interested in doing there. And to really get the health benefits of parks, there needs to be a focus on getting people safely to the parks that have the amenities that they want. And with parks being so crucial for health and well-being, it's especially important that they're accessible to all people, but unfortunately, this is not always the case. For example, in the US, ULI did a survey and found that 38% of people say that their neighborhood lacks outdoor space where they can exercise, and this disproportionately impacts lower income communities and Black and Brown communities. But even where parks exist, there are still inequities. People may live near, things that are considered parks on a map, but they may be unwelcoming, in disrepair, lack culturally relevant programming, or don't meet their needs for other reasons. A Trust for Public Land study released last year reported that across the United States, parks serving primarily non-white populations are half the size of parks that serve majority white populations. And those parks in typically Black and Brown neighborhoods also serve 5 times as many people. So there's a supply gap that has real equity implications. And we've seen that in the US, parks departments and cities in general have strained budgets, and those have been further affected by the economic challenges of COVID, meaning that cities and communities really are going to need to seek out and embrace new cross-sector partnerships to best support parks. And even before COVID, parks departments really struggled to maintain the parks that they already have, let alone to create new spaces to meet increases in population and improve park equity and park quality across cities. Parks departments are really struggling financially to bridge these equity gaps. So we really see real estate leaders emerging as key players in supporting park creation, maintenance, and programming, and cross-sector partnerships among the real estate development industry, the public sector, nonprofit organizations, the philanthropic community, as well as resident champions are proving essential for park success. And these partnerships can also enhance real estate value and support community health and well-being. Again, this is so critical because parks departments are underfunded in so many places. In the US, it's estimated that if current trends extend to 2025, which is not that far away, there will be a funding gap for parks of $102 billion. And we've seen that successful partnerships can create value for all parties. It doesn't need to be, a give and take in either or. Real estate developers that support parks as part of their associated developments see benefits like securing better community buy-in, support from the public sector, or valuable zoning incentives for their projects, which can lead to faster project approvals and other potential financial benefits. Community, nonprofit, and philanthropic organizations may leverage investment in parks to support overall improved neighborhood well-being and meet the needs of people that they serve. And public sector organizations may find that cross-sector partnerships can lower development and operations costs for certain parks, which frees up public resources for other parks. So I wanted to share 2 case study examples that demonstrate the power of partnerships related to parks and where developers had strong partnerships with communities and parks departments. So the first is Domino Park in Brooklyn, New York. Domino Park is part of a mixed-use project that includes a 6-acre public park and a planned over 3 million square feet of office, retail, and mixed-income residential development. And 700 out of a planned 2,200 housing units are also affordable units. So following the closure of the Domino Sugar Factory in 2004, this 11-acre site sat dormant as plans for redevelopment were debated by the city, by community stakeholders, and the original development team that purchased the site from Domino. And ultimately, the city approved a residential rezoning in 2010. The plan had not yet been executed when Two Trees Management Company acquired the land in 2012. But instead of executing the already approved plan, which would have been the easy thing to do, Two Trees worked with various city departments and community organizers to solicit new ideas through design charrettes and by canvassing the neighborhood in Spanish, Polish, and English. And Two Trees learned that area residents cared most about maximizing the park space in that area. So as a result of broad and inclusive outreach, new development plans that did include more dense development were approved in 2014. By updating the site plans and electing to go through a rezoning process and a public referendum, Two Trees really took a risk, but it paid off. The new plans, which included 6 acres of public park space, but again, also included a denser building footprint, which I didn't think would get much support, were approved with pretty broad community support. And this project, really importantly, allows waterfront access for the first time in over a century. So Two Trees Management, the developer, develops the park and manages daily operations. And often there may be concerns over park access when a private sector entity owns or operates park space. So in the case of Domino Park, Two Trees entered into an agreement with the city that set guidelines for design, maintenance, and access, including hours of operation. So the city has the right to reclaim the park if Two Trees fails to adhere to these standards. So in the end, Domino operates like a city park, but Two Trees invests roughly $2 million annually for operations, which they see as a really great investment to support the success of their associated real estate development. And at the same time, New York City residents have a new park that is delivered quickly and with minimal financial investment from the city. And before you tell me that whatever happens in New York City is not replicable, the other example that I'd like to touch on is Meadowbrook Park, which is an 80-acre public park in Prairie Village, a suburb of Kansas City. The park opened in 2019 alongside a 45-acre residential and mixed-use development, and this is all on the site of a former private country club. So Meadowbrook Park was funded by tax increment financing bonds that were levied on the property tax revenues generated from the private development. And the Johnson County Park and Recreation District created, owns, and operates the park. So the developer, Van Trust Real Estate, had said that residents had been living in the area and paying taxes to support the county park system, but before Meadowbrook, they didn't have a 10-minute walk or even a 10-minute drive to a high-quality park. So this really filled a needed gap in access. And the county parks director has noted that they wouldn't have been able to provide the amount or the quality of park space without partnering with Van Trust Real Estate and the city of Prairie Village to set up this type of tax increment financing. So a series of public meetings informed park planning. They had a lot of public involvement. Trails were designed to connect to the new development and preserve existing trees. And playground equipment was chosen by residents, including kids, via an open voting process. There's a lot of trust and collaboration among the public and private sector partners that helped generate a unified voice when presented to the community, so it led to very little public opposition to the development. And as a result, Van Trust was able to develop a project that had enough density to be financially successful on just 40% of the land that it controlled. The land for the park was purchased from Van Trust by the city of Prairie Village and then transferred to the county. So just to get clear, this partnership and the TIF financing eventually transformed 80 acres of privately owned land into publicly owned and operated space, which I think is a really incredible story. So as I mentioned previously, even where parks might look available on paper, on a map, inequities exist among them in terms of maintenance, available amenities, programming, etc. Quality is a central tenet of the goal of 10-minute walk. And parks departments and other park operators and managers are increasingly looking for ways to evaluate the quality of their parks. So it really isn't just enough to map a 10-minute walk shed around existing designated parks and say that you've met the goal. Cities and municipalities comprehensively must ensure that all of the parks adequately serve their users with the amenities and services that the neighborhoods want. And we sort of wanted to understand if there were ways to more strategically and holistically define or evaluate park quality. What does it really mean to have a high quality park? So through interviews with park professionals and research into existing evaluation tools, we came up with 5 characteristics that a high quality park has that includes but also goes beyond maintenance and condition, which seem to be the things that most park departments and professionals focus on. But we think that to be truly high quality, to truly serve intended populations, you really have to look at the users and their needs. So high quality parks are of course in excellent physical condition, but they're also accessible to users in terms of physical access, but also affordability and just general awareness of the park and its amenities. High quality parks provide positive experiences for users in terms of the activities and the feelings of comfort and welcomeness that they offer. They're also relevant to the communities they serve with diverse programming and activities and with community members engaged in decision-making opportunities. High quality parks are also flexible and adaptable, as we've seen many times during the COVID pandemic. And this is also relevant when thinking about how parks support sustainability and climate resilience. And when parks departments or park owners and operators are seeking to assess the quality of their park or park systems, equity really has to be centered in that process in order to address widespread disparities in park quality. So for example, parks professionals should use data and community conversations to ensure that quality evaluations take into account things like shifts in demographics, the local history and experiences of people of color, and how parks have been part of those experiences. This understanding can better inform local definitions of quality, evaluation metrics and techniques, and eventual investments in policy changes. In addition, evaluation and data collection teams that are actually assessing the quality should include people of color and the residents of the community served by the parks being evaluated, people that aren't typically involved in those types of processes. And this is another photo of Domino Park, which I just think is a really good example of an overall development process that really listened to the community and changed already approved plans, no small feat, to make sure that the overall plan for the site better met the needs of the community, that the park was what the community wanted, and the response that this park has gotten has been tremendous. And there are 2 reports that we put out recently if you're interested in diving deeper into any of the case studies or examples I discussed, and they also feature other case studies. All of our reports are available at uli.org/parks. The 2 in particular that I've drawn on today are called 5 Characteristics of High Quality Parks and Successful Partnerships for Parks, and I think they've also been put in the chat. So as we continue to work with our members and land use professionals more broadly to create more equitable and healthier places and communities, we know that parks are at the heart of amazing developments and places. They add value to communities, and during the pandemic, they've served people and neighborhoods in ways that we probably didn't even think of before. So it's imperative that all people, regardless of income or race or ethnicity or religion or age or any other demographic, feel safe in and have access to high quality parks, and that funding for parks and public spaces continues to be prioritized by communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Lyric, who's going to share more on parks as economic engines.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. Hold on just 1 second. Okay, so thank you so much for that beautiful presentation, Sarah. I really love hearing about ULI's work, and especially how you're showcasing the importance of working with multiple sectors, and especially having community members and their needs being at the center of design. As you also noted, I think that really is the heart of how we move forward with the impact, or move forward from the impacts of COVID. Hi all, my name is Lyric Kelker, and I'm the policy director at an organization called Inclusive Action for the City based in Los Angeles. I'm going to talk to you about what we are calling the open air economy and the importance of parks and open space in a just recovery from the pandemic. Inclusive Action's mission, Inclusive Action is a nonprofit community development financial institution, and our mission is to bring people together to build strong local economies, and we do this through two major avenues: through policy advocacy and by providing access to capital to vulnerable entrepreneurs in our community. So as we all know, this past year and a half has been really tough. Millions of people are at risk of eviction. Thousands and thousands of small businesses have been permanently closed. Parks and outdoor spaces have been highlighted as a safe haven, and yet they're often closed off from the communities that they serve. But many people were struggling before the pandemic, and this crisis has been one not only of health, but also of equity, housing, capital, and more, especially for our neighbors who have been most impacted. Nearly 3 in 10 people had no savings before the pandemic. The entrepreneurs we serve needed cash to survive the pandemic, and instead, small business owners were being asked to take on debt for a crisis that they did not cause. Small businesses were unprepared to pivot their business models, and those changes required cash that they didn't have on hand. Household debt was already an issue, especially for people of color, but many have begun seeking out loans to do things like pay back rent or utilities and other necessary items to keep living. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the smallest businesses that we have in Los Angeles. That's street vendors. We support street vendors because they are a microcosm of our economy. It takes a cross-sectoral and intersectional approach to ensure that entrepreneurs like these are supported both in times of crisis and while everything is functioning normally. This group of entrepreneurs saw unique challenges during the pandemic that ultimately harms the communities they serve and builds our knowledge of how to create more sustainable systems that serve all constituents. Centering the needs of micro-entrepreneurs and communities most severely impacted by centuries of intentional harmful policy, as well as most impacted by COVID, will be integral to a just recovery that begs the use of public spaces and parks. So to give you an idea of how COVID impacted these entrepreneurs, I have some statistics here to paint the picture. Sidewalk vendors in LA produce $500 million in economic activity annually, and prior to the pandemic, they had an average annual income of $11,300. And at the onset of COVID, we saw 96% of these micro businesses saw a drop in sales. We at Inclusive Action and with our partners in the LA Street Vendor Campaign put together an emergency cash fund for street vendors because many of them did not qualify for any other form of relief. Through that process, we were able to get a snapshot of what nearly 3,000 of these entrepreneurs were experiencing. 57% are behind on utilities, 46% had to take out loans to make ends meet, and 60% are behind on their rent. So vendors, when these small businesses like vendors are hurt, the communities they serve hurt. Vendors are a resource to our communities. Communities that have been most impacted by racist policies such as redlining, urban renewal, and white flight depend on the goods and services of street vendors. Removing or deeply inhibiting vendors means cutting off communities they serve from access to affordable fresh produce, clothing, electronics, and more. And parks and open space are a vital part of supporting these local economies and long neglected communities. Although we did see that parks serve this critical resource in underserved and under-resourced communities, we also saw multiple instances in Los Angeles where public spaces like vibrant parks were being violently closed down and becoming hostile environments for our unhoused neighbors as well as vendors who had been serving their communities for years. But we've learned a lot in the last year and a half, and have reaffirmed many things that, frankly, most of the people here listening already knew. This is a once-in-a-generation moment, and we need to take what we have learned and have long known and invest in people, public spaces, and public infrastructure. This is the only way we can recover from COVID in an equitable manner. Trillions of dollars are being deployed across the country as stimulus, and we have seen how much of it has been mishandled, but community-based and advocacy groups such as those you're hearing from today, know how to integrate the needs and put them at the center of our investment and infrastructure. So parks are and must be at the core of our recovery, part of an integrated infrastructure effort. Parks are an existing infrastructure that supports communities and provides necessary space for post-pandemic life. They were the site of mutual aid, vital resource distribution, heating and cooling centers, safe havens for the unhoused, and more in the last year. Street vendors naturally program a space in a culturally relevant way, and they create more foot traffic, safety, and encourage outdoor use on top of serving the needs of the community that the parks exist in. Vendors, parks, and public spaces must be at the center of the necessary open air economy post-COVID. So, how do we move forward? I'm going to close off with a few questions we have been thinking about at Inclusive Action and through collaboratives such as La Rosa that have been working on this exact issue for a really long time. As we move into a world where we're building around COVID, we have to take into account the rules that govern public space. Do they criminalize or facilitate new opportunities? How are we being intersectional in our work, and what sectors are missing when we activate these spaces? As we build out these spaces and program more, have we explored how open space intersects with market forces? We need to be centered on the needs of communities. So what are the values that define our approach to placemaking over the coming years of recovery? How are we going to take what we learned and have pivoted to do in the last 18 months and put it to use to serve the people who have been most impacted? So I know that I asked you a lot of questions for those listening to consider, but if you have any questions for me, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're going to get to some right here, but with that, I'll pass it to Daryl.
We'll go ahead and have all of our panelists turn on your cameras as well, so we can have an interactive session here. Go ahead, Daryl.
Wow, that was a really intense discussion and presentation on the state of parks, during the pandemic, but also what set this up. And I think that what's really telling to me is that we had a lot of historical context that was shared. Things like redlining, the way communities were underinvested and disinvested through white flight that have kind of set us up for a criminalization of legacy community members and youth that generally tend to use parks as a resource and as an amenity. So I really want to get to some of the questions that folks have shared, because I see that we had upwards of 700 attendees, and I think that there's a vital conversation out there that folks are itching to be a part of. Do we have any questions for our panelists?
Yes, we do. We have several. So I'm going to just remind folks, you can continue to submit questions via the questions tab. We've got many already, but I just wanted to be able to share some with the panel so we can move forward with the discussion. And I'm actually going to start with one that came in toward the end, actually, when you were speaking. And that is from Keith Penkoskis, who's asking, can you expand on your experience and the role that parks play in disaster recovery? I feel like this will be more and more commonplace in the years to come with a changing climate.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. That's an excellent question, and there is a group here in Los Angeles called La Rosa, the LA Regional Open Space and Affordable Housing Collaborative, that really focuses on climate resilience and having parks as infrastructure as an integrated component of a holistic community, right? And it's something that I think everybody here has been talking about, and parks, as we saw in the last year, are the space where folks have been gathering and have distributed all of the necessary resources for folks, everything from food to blankets to everything, heating and cooling centers, and ensuring that folks who live outside have a place to take refuge. And the using parks as an integrated infrastructure is not only an issue of climate resiliency, but also absolutely necessary moving forward as we go into a post-COVID world. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Can I ask as a follow-up question? I don't want to take away from folks in the panel, but Lyric, we know that we need multi-scalar approaches. And so most of the focus on disaster planning is on built environments like the super, dome and placing people in structures like dorms. What role can parks play as an outdoor facility in terms of providing some of that same support, but looking at, things like tents and other, non-built structures?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Daryl. So here in Los Angeles, we've seen that parks have already existed as that infrastructure for a lot of our unhoused neighbors, and it makes sense that they would take refuge in a park because it has a lot of the amenities that one needs to live, including stuff like bathrooms, usually has water and those types of facilities. And parks, something beautiful that I think everybody here knows is that they're incredibly programmable spaces. And so they're flexible in terms of what can and cannot be put up. And I think that's going to be super key in any sort of resiliency effort, because for each disaster, unfortunately, there's going to be different needs, right? And so you're going to need different types of resources for different populations. In Los Angeles, we're all waiting for the big one, is what they call it, and that's the earthquake. We have seen the detriment that has happened in Louisiana and up the East Coast from Hurricane Ida. And so those needs are going to be different. And parks play that flexible, programmable space that we know can serve these communities.
Okay, thanks, Lyric. Next question here is, I guess, for all the panel that want to answer it. In some urban areas, park managers have turned to fencing to promote safety and security. What have you seen or experienced in terms of the fencing of parks and green space and access to these amenities?
I mean, I can start. I see the benefit, especially I have 2 small kids. I'd love to be able to have a park where I can keep kids in. But I think when you're fencing to lock people out, I mean, that has huge access and equity implications. And I'm thinking about, initiatives. Trust for Public Land has a joint schoolyards project. There are so many schools across the country that have this built-in play space for kids, and like could be parks for cities, but they're locked after school hours. And so it's really important to start these partnerships with school districts to really enhance the access to spaces in communities where that's maybe the only green space, but if it's locked after hours and you can't access it, it's not really a good community benefit. And research has shown that, there's a lot of issues that people bring up, like security and safety, and there's a lot of resources out there that provide a lot of great advice on how to navigate that. So I don't know, in my opinion, saying that you're going to put up a fence for security issues is not I feel like there's something deeper there. Like, it's not really just about like keeping the park safe, keeping the people safe. It's really more about keeping people out. And so I'm not a super proponent on fencing spaces like that.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Next question here is a general question again, I think, to everybody here, and that is, how do we reconcile the efforts to make park space more equitable with the statistics that nearby parks can increase property values? And is it time to stop focusing on property or monetary values in considering this?
I can take a stab at that one. I think that if the parks are designed for the people who live in the community, if there is a co-creation, if there's an opportunity for the people who live there now to have input in terms of what is a quality park, then you have less displacement than if you come in as a parks department, as a planner, as a city and say, this is what we're going to put here, and all the parks look exactly the same. I know that we've seen that there often are differences in terms of what is valued and asked for depending on the community that is living around and using the park. And so if there is the opportunity to co-create, then you will have parks that are unique to that community and can be you know, a good and quality park, but it may not look exactly the same for every community.
I think that's a great answer. And I also just wanted to add, and I've lost my train of thought. So I think, you know, the issue, green gentrification, I think has come up a lot lately is, you know, we want to build all these parks and all these communities across the country, and then all of a sudden it's going to increase people's property values. And I think that cities need to be looking at that and enacting policies to prevent, you know, major tax increases to homeowners or property owners that would then increase the rent. I mean, I think that cities need to be really doing things to prevent displacement, because if we keep putting parks everywhere to serve communities that don't have parks, and then these people are forced to move because all of a sudden they can't afford to live there, we're really not doing anything to move the needle on equity.
I would agree with Sarah, and you know, I think a key component of our work is you know, enacting anti-displacement strategies alongside community development. And I would encourage cities and other entities to take a similar approach, even not as a community-based organization. Maybe you're not going to use as much grassroots organizing strategies, but you know, I think, as Sarah mentioned, there are many policies that can be enacted and other ways to ensure that as you are developing a park, it will increase property values, even if, you know, that it's an unintended consequence. And so I think being really proactive in creating a plan around anti-displacement in any park development is really, really key to success.
Great, thanks, Anna. Actually, we also have a question for you on your experience and what you were talking about previously. Can you describe how the Verde community enterprises function, and how does the money flow, and what types of corporations are they going to? For example, 501c3, et cetera.
Yeah, so the social enterprises are a part of our 501c3. I don't work closely with the social enterprises, so I'm going to skip the question about how the money flows, but I can get back to you about that. But basically the goal is for our Verde Builds enterprise, we are a licensed general contractor, and so we're able to hire subcontractors and train subs to gain experience on big projects, so that then they are able to take on projects on their own. And so we're really, it's a sort of a workforce training program where we're building the skills of minority-owned businesses to be able to continue to build their skills around contracting. Verde Landscape unfortunately closed at the end of the pandemic, but that was a social enterprise landscape program, and we actually hired individuals in a training program to learn about green landscaping skills. And so they would install bioswales, rain gardens, native plantings, and then be able to use those skills to gain jobs in other environmental sectors.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Here's I guess a general question for all of the panelists. Do any of the communities or panelists, are you familiar with a requirement of the percentage of land that needs to be set aside for parks and open space in your communities? Is there an example out there of that your communities are working with?
I know there was a rule of thumb, and this might be a really old number. I think this is also just for public land. It's like 10 acres per, I'm going to get this wrong, but I feel like it's like 10 acres of parks for 10,000 people is, somebody can fact check me on that. But there is sort of a rule of thumb out there on like how many acres are sufficient to support, you know, population. So like as population increases, you really should be sort of concurrently adding new park space. And I'm trying to think if I know of any communities offhand that have standards, but that is a standard that I've heard sort of generally.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. And this one's from Patricia Hauser, who's saying, there were some wonderful examples here of links between affordable housing opportunities and parks. Do you have any quick examples of case studies where park development and redevelopment have been linked to active transportation options like protected bike lanes?
So that was part of the Cully Park project. We were able to redevelop the street leading up to the park, Northeast 72nd Avenue, which created a shared biking and walking path where there had not been sidewalks or a bike lane. And we also were able to repave the road, which was full of potholes, and create some green infrastructure there, some bioswales and native plantings along the Green Street. It was the first Green Street developed by Verde in a partnership with the city. I would also say that the park's planning effort around access to the park, both at Cully Park, but in other parks in the city as well, have helped move forward active transportation infrastructure in the surrounding area through advocacy with the transportation department, sharing the needs for safe access to the park. Community members participated in walks and were able to share their concerns and the barriers to accessing the park. And then that in turn was shared with the city. And we are now starting to see some shared walking and bike paths coming into the neighborhood and some safer access to Cully Park and other areas.
And just to add, I can't think very fast on my feet anymore. I'm sure I could think of examples if I had more time of projects that did this, but this sort of brought up for me that, you know, oftentimes when you're talking about a city and like putting in bike infrastructure and putting in sidewalks and parks, you're talking about different departments. And I think this just sort of like underscores the importance of cities like better collaborating between departments, because I think they really don't. Not to pick on Los Angeles, but I worked on a project a couple of years ago with the City of LA Rec and Parks Department, and we learned through them that there's like, I don't know, like 7 different city departments are all developing parks or public space separately, no coordination. And so when you've got that happening, like you certainly don't have Public Works coordinating with the Parks Departments on like putting in bike lanes at the same time that they're doing a parks improvement project. And another thing that this brought up to me is just, you know, that piece is so critical when you're talking about, you know, with the 10-minute walk movement, like a 10-minute walk to a park, you have to have that infrastructure, that access to a park. You could have the best park in the world, but, you know, if it's on a super busy street and there's no crosswalks and there's no sidewalks and people can't get there, it's also not really, you know, serving the needs of the community as best as I could. So I can try to think of more examples. ULI also has an active transportation report that we put out several years ago on our website, uli.org/health, that it's more focused on like the real estate component, but you know, it's all about trails and bike lanes, and I'm positive that there's probably examples in there of parks as well.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Next question here is from Stephanie Brewer, who asks, we are in the process of establishing a new pocket park in a downtown area. Are there any particular park development considerations we should keep in mind while working on the design and public engagement activities? Which one of you wants to take on that?
Can you read the question again? I'm sorry.
Sure. It's an example here where the questioner is saying that they're in the process of establishing a new pocket park in a downtown area and are asking, are there any particular park development considerations we should keep in mind while working on the design and public engagement activities?
I can speak like to general public engagement. I think you want to think about who currently is using that space or in that area, as well as there may be people who have historic connections to that space, whether it be We talked a little bit about displacement. So there might be people who maybe lived in that neighborhood and have been gentrified out, or those who may have historic connections to the land like Native Americans. And so you can consider those types of historical connections. Also thinking about even in downtown areas. I live in Atlanta and there's a lot of businesses downtown, but there actually are people who live there, and taking into account not just the businesses who might be very vocal or easy to see, but also connecting with those people who are living in that area and working in that area. Also thinking about the unhoused who may be using that space or may begin to use that space. But I think it's really important when you think about engagement to think about ways that you can make it meaningful, so that you're not just like having a meeting and saying, this is what we're going to do, isn't it great? But also thinking about, as you're leading up to it, trying to engage people as you're really planning how you're going to use the space, taking into consideration if there are, like sometimes there's issues that you don't know about because you're not there, you know, for a full year. So there may be things that happen in the spring or in the winter. And if you engage with people who have lived experience in that space, they may be able to ask questions that you won't think of or bring up issues that you may not consider. So I think really being open to having those conversations, and it might involve, you know, well, it's COVID. I'm in Atlanta, so it's really COVID-y now. But if you can get out and walk and talk to people, that can be really helpful. There may be other ways to connect with established leaders or community organizations in that area. That's just some suggestions on how, with a relatively small pocket park in an urban area, you might be able to engage people in a meaningful way.
And early and often, and I would also add, and I love COVID-y, I'm going to use that. I would also add that a colleague of mine in Philadelphia sort of coined this term iterative placemaking. So to the extent you can, I would just try like low cost things and see what resonates with people, especially if you're not entirely positive who is going to be using this site. If it is in a downtown area, again, there probably are built-in residential, but like it also might be a more transient like office population, or if it's near, you know, a transit exchange station, like there might be different people coming and going. So, you know, I would say like test things and see what works, and do surveys and see what people like. And also there's this, people really like the movable furniture. And I think that's also really important, you know, in terms of pandemic, like to be able to move away and have your own space and move with people. And I think there's a hesitancy often to use that, but I think you can get them for really cheap, and people have found like they're not really stolen very often, as often as you would think. But I would say just experiment. And the report I mentioned, 5 Characteristics of High Quality Parks, has sort of a framework with a lot of key questions that you can be asking as you're sort of looking at how to make the best park possible in your context. So I would, not to plug it, but I would recommend checking that out.
Great, thanks, Sarah. We'll ask a few more questions before we get to the kind of closing thoughts here. And actually, the next question here is for Lyric. How has the city accepted the use of public parks for private businesses? I've seen those activities have been frowned upon and see differently compared to the use of other public spaces such as sidewalks and street vendor types of activities.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In parks, there's a couple of different things that happen that we see in Los Angeles, at least. There's a fair amount of parks, not enough. And some of them have what are called exclusive concession agreements. And so there might actually be some sort of food business that's in there. And they have a concession agreement with the Rec and Parks Department saying that they exclusively can sell. And so that business can and might still operate in many of these parks. As advocates of street vendors, we actually disagree with the exclusive part. Like there should be concession agreements, but that usually means that sidewalk vendors are not allowed in those spaces. And we know that those two types of businesses are actually mutually beneficial. So a brick and mortar business and street vendors typically don't actually have clientele together. And so they increase foot traffic to one another. That said, over the course of the pandemic, there has been like outright ban in some places of street vendors, and parks was kind of one of those places. And there was a very high profile park called Echo Park Lake that was fenced off. And it really clearly was meant to keep people out, as Sarah was talking about earlier, versus making it a secure space. In terms of other public spaces and what we've seen of the stuff like the Alfresco program in Los Angeles, that's been really successful. And we think that they should be including that type of innovation when they're programming parks as well, and ensuring that public space is utilized in a way that serves the local communities. And there's, in LA, there's no lack of community-based organizations in most neighborhoods. And so chances are there are some like really hyper local experts to be able to help program those spaces to ensure that it actually meets the needs of the community that you're looking to serve.
Great, thanks, Larry. Here's a question for Sarah, which is from William Michaud, who was saying, what can be done to ensure that parks provide equitable benefits after they're built? What can be done to monitor their use, get community input, and adapt?
I think that's always the hardest part that people don't always think about. You know, you're so focused on building the park, getting the park built and having the park opened, and hopefully on, you know, community engagement to figure out what should even go into the park, that I think that sort of evaluation component is often, you know, put to the side. I think it's really important. So, you know, in doing this report on what is a high quality park, we really tried to take a look at quality evaluations, and it's really important to do them regularly, not just when you're thinking about designing a new park. I mean, I think, you know, I mentioned that parks departments have really strapped budgets, so this is where partnerships and like really relying on community members can help. But you need to be able to go to parks and you know, do surveys and do inventories and see who is using it, who isn't using it. I think the city of San Francisco, I don't remember when this was, but they hired a consultant to, you know, go to different locations around parks like dry cleaners or corner stores and basically ask the people that were in there, this is obviously pre-pandemic, you know, do you use this park? And if not, why not? Because I think it's just as important to understand the needs of the people that are using the park as it is to understand the needs of people who aren't, but could be because they are residents, and what are the reasons why. I think it's hard, you know, Lyric mentioned earlier, like parks are just inherently flexible spaces, and you know, there's sort of the tension between like, you want to have all of this stuff in there, but you also want enough space for that flexibility. So I think that's where just sort of evaluating the entire system and seeing what you have. You know, my neighborhood here, I'm really lucky. We have 3 different parks that we can walk to within a 10-minute walk, and they all sort of have different things. It's just sort of, you know, not just looking at individual parks, but how the entire system impacts equity. Is just as important when you're trying to do those comprehensive quality evaluations that, you know, I don't think they're done as comprehensively or as often as they should be, but I think that's the only way you can really tell, are you meeting your goals with equity? You have to measure.
Thanks, Sarah. I guess we'll have one last question before we have our closing thoughts here, and that is, some lower income areas get parks, but maintenance is lacking. How can we make sure that upkeep is budgeted for? Anyone have some thoughts on that?
I mean, I think this is where we really have to push. You know, it's often like the people that scream the loudest get the things that they need. So, you know, if someone in a wealthier area has like a problem with their park and they call the parks department over and over because they feel comfortable doing that, and you know, they call the cops or whatever they do, and somebody comes out and addresses it right away. And I think, you know, there is this inherent distrust of government. This is where we really need the cities, the public sector, but also community partners sort of, I think, step up and really prioritize, especially from the city, like prioritize equity, like do assessments of your park systems and see what are the ones that are underfunded and why are they being underfunded, and how do we reallocate. A lot of cities are looking at like, how do I reallocate my resources so that it's not just, you know, I have 4 wards in my city and each of them gets an equal distribution of the money. Like, it's not about doing it equally, it's about doing it equitably. So you have to start looking at those parks that have been consistently underfunded and prioritize those. It's not about you're being unfair to the other parks. It's about, you know, you're trying to just like bring it up to the level of some of the other parks in the system. So I think that is, again, where a comprehensive like park equity quality you know, evaluation can really come into play.
Can I add something super quick?
Go ahead.
there are literal trillions of dollars coming down from the federal government specifically for COVID recovery, and understanding and placing parks as a required mechanism for an equitable and just recovery is a way that you can get funding through your local governments. I recognize I come from Los Angeles, so we get a ton of that money just because it's a huge population, right? But even smaller cities and more local jurisdictions that have much less population, they can look to their counties and other larger jurisdictions and start talking to them about how they can get some of the ARP funding or the CARES money, the literal trillions of dollars that are coming down, and make sure that it's being used locally by the community-based organizations with assistance from these national organizations who have the know-how on like all the different components of the parks and what's needed to make it happen from the leveraging funding standpoint.
Thank you. Okay, well, looking where we are at the time, I'm going to stop the questions. Just unfortunately, we never get to all of them. And thanks to everybody who submitted not only a number of questions, but also some comments in response to some of the points that were made. So thank you for some of the clarifications and other information, and we'll share that with the panel as well. So we do want to close, as we often do, with some closing thoughts. And since we have a number of panelists here today, I think just wanted to ask you all if you wanted to share some final takeaways that you hope people will, having heard all of the discussion today, keep in mind in their own work moving forward. And let's kind of go backwards from the order of the presenters. So if we can start with Lyric there, and we'll go through back to Daryl at the end.
Sure. I'd say closing thoughts are to recognize, understand, and treat community members as the experts that they are, and what it is that they need to program, service, and maintain parks, as well as the park users, as Sarah mentioned, especially the micro businesses who serve those parks, and that is their livelihood, and make sure that these populations are meaningfully and respectfully engaged, and their needs are heard when you're developing whatever comes of those conversations.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
I'll just say, I think developers can be really good community partners. I know they sort of have a reputation, but a huge benefit to either convincing or requiring a developer to add park space to developments is that that it really does free up resources for cities that have already strapped budgets, as I've mentioned, to invest in parks in other areas. So I think to the extent that cities are willing to kind of push developers beyond what they normally do, or even enact policies to require green space, I think it'll really help cities in the end. And those developers, they want to do the right thing. They don't, and I know the financial argument isn't always the best argument, but I mean, I think it's a win-win. When developers can control certain parks, then it frees up resources for cities to really focus in the parks where they might be needed a little bit more.
Great, thank you. Anna?
Yeah, thank you. I would just really encourage you all to think about innovative ways to deeply engage community in park design. Ways that you may not think are possible, looking for different funding sources to be able to stipend community members, to be able to honor their time spent on projects. We often ask for community voice, but often don't provide ways for people to sit at the table who aren't paid by their job to be there. So I think just really encourage you all to think outside the box in the ways that you engage community, and also in really thinking through your anti-displacement analysis around parks and development, looking at tools that have been used in other places, and making sure to integrate that into any new park development.
Great, thank you. Ayanna?
I would just say that everyone is at a different place in their equity journey, and being willing to continue to ask the hard questions and have the conversations and be in rooms where people may not be happy to see you, but they still have information and perspectives that you're not gonna have if you don't go into those spaces. Moving beyond just engaging to co-creating to making sure you have complementary programs and conversations, be adaptive, and really move towards transformative sorts of projects. And place-based solutions are really going to be where you're going to find the best solutions, because one size does not fit all.
Great, thank you. And Daryl, we'll let you finish as you kicked us off today. You'll need to unmute, Daryl. Sorry about that.
I was saying, I think my thought is that vulnerable communities are often ground zero for healthcare and equity. And I think that we touched on it a lot in each of the presentations. So I just wanted to center that conversation around ecosystem services. Parks provide a lot in terms of the natural benefit that humans derive, especially the vulnerable communities that really need access to clean air, potential access to water, potential access for open space. And so I really want to make sure that we kind of close out on the benefit of ecosystem services as not just an aesthetic for the privileged, but an aesthetic for all of us. It's a right.
Great, thank you, Daryl. And a number of folks asked questions and pointed that out in the questions tab there as well. So maybe that's something we'll want to address in a future webinar. But today will conclude our webinar of Parks as Community Infrastructure During and Beyond the Pandemic, Building Trust to Advance Equity. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to our panelists for a great discussion, to everyone who attended today, to our colleagues at EPA who helped organize this, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email, especially if you need that to claim other credits other than AICPCM. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, which will soon be distributed. And with that, I wish you all a great day.